October 2006. For months married to one of the most famous actresses on the planet. For months after promises of eternal love under Australian stars. For months in, and Keith Urban was checking into rehab. Just like that. The fairy tale marriage the whole world celebrated was blowing up all over the headlines. The man who looked like he had conquered everything crashed so hard that not even love could pull him back. This is Keith Urban, guitar virtuoso, 4-time Grammy winner, over 20 million albums sold, a straight-up legend. But behind that shine sits a brutal truth. A man who nearly died twice, not in accidents, but by his own hands. So how does someone sitting at the absolute peak of success relapse so devastatingly, just months after the so-called perfect wedding? What really went down behind the scenes when the cameras were off? And how did he survive when the entire world watched his fall in real time? Before we answer any of that, we gotta rewind. Because Keith Urban's battle didn't start under bright spotlights. It started somewhere nobody had ever heard of. Cobbler, a place where dreams weren't born. They quietly faded under the weight of everyday life. Dirt roads ran between modest homes. The nearest city, Brisbane, felt like a whole different universe. And in that isolated slice of rural Australia, Keith Urban grew up knowing exactly what it meant to want something the world around you just couldn't give. His father, Bob, worked non-stop at the local convenience store. Hands rough from stocking shelves, counting change, opening early, closing late. The grind never stopped. His mother, Mary Ann, stayed bent over her sewing machine deep into the night, turning fabric into income one stitch at a time. Money was tight. Luxuries didn't exist. But love, fierce, stubborn love, filled every crack where comfort couldn't reach. When Keith was just 6 years old, his father made a move that changed everything. After months of scraping and saving, Bob walked into a music shop and bought a second-hand acoustic guitar. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even pretty. But when he placed it into Keith's small hands, he whispered words the boy would carry forever. "This is yours. Make something of it." Keith didn't just hold that guitar. He latched onto it like a life raft. While other kids played football or rode bikes down dusty roads, Keith sat on the front porch, fingers bleeding from steel strings, learning chords by ear straight from the radio. He played until his fingertips cracked. He played until neighbors complained. He played until that guitar wasn't just an instrument anymore. It was part of him. Inseparable. Essential. By 8 years old, he was already entering talent competitions across Queensland, school halls, county fairs, local festivals. If there was a stage, Keith was on it. His voice hadn't dropped yet, but his fingers moved with a precision that shocked judges twice his age. He didn't always win, but he always remembered. Every ribbon, every polite clap, every second under those dim lights turned into fuel. At school, Keith was the quiet kid, the one who didn't fit into the rough, sports-obsessed culture around him. Too thin, too focused, too different. While classmates talked cricket scores and weekend plans, Keith talked music and nothing else. He had no language for anything beyond that. Years later, he'd admit, "I felt like an alien in my own town. Music was the only place I belonged." By his early teens, Keith was performing in clubs and pubs, places reeking of stale beer and cigarette smoke. Places where grown men drank away disappointment, and Keith sang it right back to them. He was too young to drink, too young to drive himself home, but old enough to understand how one song could shut up a rowdy room. His father drove him to gigs, waited in parking lots, then drove him home in silence. A silence heavy with pride Bob rarely said out loud. But even as his talent became impossible to ignore, a shadow crept in. Applause was never enough. Small-town stages felt like cages. And deep inside, a raw hunger kept gnawing at him. A hunger not just for music, but for escape, validation, proof that the kid from Cobbler could be more than anyone ever expected. That hunger would push him to greatness, and nearly wreck him too. By his late teens, Keith Urban had conquered every Australian stage there was. Talent competitions, packed clubs, chart-climbing country tracks, he had it all. To Cobbler, he was already a star. But to Keith, Australia felt like a beautiful prison. Nashville, the word hit him like a prayer. Music City, USA, where legends were made. Where every corner buzzed with possibility. Where the Grand Ole Opry stage had carried giants like Johnny Cash and Dolly Parton. If he could make it there, Keith believed he could finally prove he wasn't just good. He was meant for this. In 1990, at 22 years old, Keith boarded a plane with nothing but a guitar, a suitcase, and reckless hope. He landed in Nashville thinking the city would instantly recognize his gift. It didn't. Nashville hit him fast and brutal. It was packed with thousands just like him. Talented, hungry, desperate. The difference? They were American. They spoke the language, knew the culture. And Keith, with his thick Australian accent and unfamiliar references, was the odd one out. He knocked on doors that never opened, played showcase after showcase in cramped bars where industry execs promised to stay in touch and never did. Demo tapes recorded with borrowed money collected dust or landed straight in trash bins. Months passed. Savings dried up. The dream that once felt guaranteed started rotting into humiliation. Within a year, Keith was broke, defeated, and invisible. He went back to Australia with his head down, not with victory, but with shame. Friends and family welcomed him warmly, but he could see the pity. He'd promised Nashville. He'd promised himself Nashville, and he'd blown it. Back home, he buried himself in work, joined a band, recorded albums, toured nonstop. By the early 90s, he was one of Australia's biggest country artists. Awards stacked up. Fans knew his name. Still, every win felt empty. Big fish, tiny pond, and the pond was suffocating. I knew I had unfinished business in Nashville, he later said. I couldn't breathe until I tried again. In 1992, Keith took a second shot. This time, no starry eyes, just grit. He washed dishes, stocked warehouses, did whatever paid the bills while he clawed forward. Played dive bars for tips. Lived in cramped apartments with roommates who barely knew him. Survived on ramen noodles and black coffee. Every meal reminding him how far he still had to go. The rejection didn't stop. Labels said his sound was too rock for country, too country for rock. Radio programmers mocked his accent. Producers told him to ditch the Australian edge, sound more American, be someone he wasn't. Every slammed door left another scar. Every no pressed heavier on his chest. Years later, Keith summed it up brutally. I was invisible again, just like I was as a kid in Cobbler. Except this time, I was invisible in the one place I thought I belonged. But invisibility teaches resilience. And in those lonely Nashville years, something inside him hardened. Not bitterness, but resolve. He wasn't leaving again. He would make them hear him, or die trying. Then, in 1997, after years of bleeding through rejection, the door finally cracked open. Capitol Records Nashville offered Keith Urban a contract. Not luck, payoff. 1,000 humiliations. 1,000 empty rooms. 1,000 times he refused to quit when quitting would have been easier. His self-titled debut album dropped in 1999, and the reaction was insane. It's a Love Thing shot up the charts faster than anyone expected, including Keith himself. Stations that once ignored him now played him nonstop. The same industry executives who had dismissed his accent now called it straight-up unique, refreshing, authentic. Suddenly, Keith Urban was not invisible. He was everywhere, like boom. Magazines featured him on covers. Award shows called his name. Fans screamed when he walked on stage. The boy from Cobbler, the man Nashville had rejected twice, was now being hailed as country music's next great hope. At 32 years old, Keith had everything he had ever dreamed of. And it was killing him, no cap, because what the world did not see, what the cameras never captured was the terror that gripped him every single day. The fear that it could all vanish as quickly as it arrived. The crushing pressure to deliver hit after hit, to tour endlessly, to smile through exhaustion, to be the star everyone now expected him to be, and to cope with that pressure. Keith turned to the only things that offered instant relief: alcohol and cocaine. At first, it was casual, real casual. A drink to calm nerves before a show, a line to stay sharp during late studio sessions. But addiction does not stay casual. It metastasizes. What began as a crutch became a cage. Keith was drinking before noon. He was using cocaine between interviews. He was stumbling onto stages so intoxicated that band members had to cover for his mistakes. I was drowning, Keith later confessed, his voice breaking with the memory. I had finally made it, and I was drowning in the very success I had fought so hard for. Friends noticed, band members whispered concerns. But Keith, terrified of appearing weak, music, terrified of losing the career he had barely grasped, lied to everyone, even to himself. He smiled for cameras while his hands shook. He signed autographs while his heart raced with paranoia. He accepted awards while his body screamed for another drink, another hit, anything to silence the noise inside his head. By 1998, less than a year after his breakthrough, Keith Urban was physically collapsing. His weight plummeted. His skin turned ashen. His eyes, once bright with ambition, became hollow and haunted. During one tour stop, he passed out backstage. Music, heart racing dangerously, body convulsing. Medics were called, and in that sterile hospital room with 4 drips feeding fluids back into his dehydrated veins, Keith faced a truth he could no longer deny. Music was an addict. And if he did not stop, fame would not matter because he would be dead, period. In late 1998, Keith checked himself into rehab for the first time. It was not a triumphant decision. It was surrender, plain and simple. The facility was quiet, music, clinical, stripped of the glamour that had nearly destroyed him. No stages, no applause, just Keith, a handful of other broken souls, and the brutal work of learning to live without the substances that had become his oxygen. 30 days, group therapy sessions where grown men wept, sleepless nights as his body screamed for chemicals it no longer received. Counselors who did not care about his chart positions, only whether he could admit the truth. I am powerless over this. When Keith emerged, he was sober, but he was not healed. Sobriety, he learned, was not a destination. Music, it was a daily battle, and the war was only beginning. The world welcomed him back with open arms. But Keith knew the truth. He had tasted fame, and it had nearly killed him. The question now was whether he could hold on to both. The career he had sacrificed everything for, and the fragile, hard-won sobriety that was all that stood between him and oblivion. Emerging from rehab, Keith Urban did not return to music as a conqueror. He returned as a survivor, low-key shaken, fragile and fearful, carrying sobriety like glass that could shatter with one wrong move. Every studio session felt like walking a tight, music rope. Every performance was a test of whether he could feel the rush of a crowd without needing chemicals to amplify it. In 2002, Keith released Golden Road, an album that would redefine not just his career, but country music itself. The lead single, Somebody Like You, was not just a song. It was a phenomenon, straight fire. With its infectious guitar riff and yearning lyrics, it climbed to #1 and stayed, music, there for 5 weeks. A dominance that country radio had rarely witnessed. The album went triple platinum. Awards flooded in. The Country Music Association named him Male Vocalist of the Year. The Academy of Country Music followed suit. Critics who once dismissed him as too rock now praised him as revolutionary. Keith Urban was no longer fighting for a seat at the table. He was setting the table, calling the shots. But behind the glittering facade, Keith was fighting a different war. Sobriety was not the gift he had imagined. It was exhausting, deadass. Every day required vigilance. Every party, every celebration, every after-show gathering where champagne flowed freely became a minefield he had to navigate with white-knuckled discipline. I would stand in rooms full of people celebrating me, Keith admitted years later, and feel completely alone because the version of me they were celebrating was sober. And staying sober meant I couldn't relax, couldn't let my guard down, couldn't be the carefree person they expected me to be. He threw himself into work as a shield. Tours stretched for months. Studio sessions bled into dawn. If he was moving, creating, performing, he reasoned, the cravings could not catch him. The guitar became more than an instrument. It became his lifeline, the one constant in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Hits kept coming. You'll Think of Me became an anthem of heartbreak, earning him his first Grammy Award in 2005. Days Go By followed another chart topper that cemented his place among country's elite. But with every award, every sold-out arena, the pressure mounted. The industry expected more. Fans demanded consistency, and Keith, terrified of disappointing the people who had finally embraced him, could not say music no. Sleep became rare. Rest felt like weakness. He toured Australia, Europe, Asia, America. A relentless carousel of airports, hotel rooms, and stages that blurred into one continuous performance. Band members watched him with concern, seeing the exhaustion etched into his face, the way his hands trembled during sound checks, the forced music, brightness in his eyes. I was running, Keith would later confess. Running from the fear that if I stopped, even for a moment, everything would collapse. The sobriety, the career, all of it. Success had arrived. But it came with a cost. Keith had not anticipated. Fame did not fill the void. Awards did not silence the whispers of doubt, and the loneliness, the same loneliness that had haunted him as an outsider in Caboolture, as a rejected dreamer in Nashville, remained. Only now it was amplified by the cruel irony that he was surrounded by millions who loved his music. Yet he felt more isolated than ever, low-key empty. The question gnawing at him was devastating in its simplicity. If sobriety meant this level of exhaustion and fame meant this depth of loneliness, what exactly had he won? In January 2005, at a Hollywood event honoring Australians in film, Keith Urban met Nicole Kidman. She was already a global icon, an Oscar-winning actress whose face graced magazine covers worldwide. He was a country singer, successful in his genre, but relatively unknown outside of Nashville's orbit. When they locked eyes across that crowded room, neither imagined the firestorm their connection would ignite. The romance moved quickly. Keith, who had spent years armoring himself against vulnerability, found in Nicole something he had never experienced: unconditional acceptance. She did not care about chart positions or award counts. She saw past the performer to the man still terrified of his own fragility. For the first time since sobriety, Keith felt he could breathe, for real. On June 25, 2006, they married in a candlelit ceremony in Sydney, Australia. It should have been pure joy. Instead, it became a media spectacle dissected by millions. Cameras captured every moment. Tabloids analyzed every detail. And almost immediately, a cruel narrative took root. Keith Urban was not good enough for Nicole Kidman. Headlines questioned the match. Oscar winner marries country singer read like a mismatch, as if talent had a hierarchy and Keith occupied a lower rung. Paparazzi followed them relentlessly. Cameras clicking, voices shouting invasive questions. Industry insiders whispered that Nicole had married down, that the union would never last, that Keith was simply a rebound after her high-profile divorce from Tom Cruise. For Keith, the scrutiny was suffocating. He was no longer just Keith Urban, Grammy-winning artist. He went from being Keith Urban to being known as Nicole Kidman's husband, a label that low-key turned him into a side character in somebody else's movie. On red carpets, photographers yelled her name and straight up acted like he wasn't even there. Music, interviewers zeroed in on her career and brushed his off like it was nothing. The kid who'd spent his whole life fighting to be noticed suddenly felt invisible all over again, lost inside the massive shadow of the woman he loved. It seriously messed with my head, Keith later confessed, keeping it real for once. I was proud of her, loved her like crazy, but at the same time I felt like I was fading out. The pressure cranked up as they tried to blend two gigantic careers into one life. Nicole was off filming on location for months. Keith was touring non-stop, hopping continents. And when they finally linked back up, paparazzi were right there, snapping every hug, every look, turning private love into public content. Privacy became something they just couldn't afford anymore. Even their quiet moments got snatched up, shot through long lenses, flipped to tabloids starving for drama. Friends started noticing the shift. Keith, who used to light up talking about music, got guarded whenever his marriage came up. He dodged questions. He pasted on smiles during joint interviews. And behind closed doors, that crushing feeling of not being enough started caving him in again. The old voices crept back, the ones that had followed him since he was a kid. You don't belong. You're not good enough. You'll never stack up. Nicole, to her credit, pushed back hard against the music storyline. She spoke out about Keith's talent, his heart, his genius as an artist. She showed up at his shows, stood side stage, cheered louder than anyone. But even though it was real, it didn't shut the noise down. If anything, it made it louder, setting up this vibe where she looked like she was shielding him, which only fed the idea that he needed saving. The marriage was legit, the love was undeniable, but the pressure just wouldn't let up. And Keith, barely 4 years sober, still scarred from addiction that hadn't fully loosened its grip, started to crack under a weight no amount of love could completely carry. The world saw a fairy tale. Keith felt like he was drowning all over again. And this time, bright lights and screaming fans couldn't pull him out. Only 4 months after saying, "I do," That fairy tale was about to blow up in the worst way imaginable. October 2006. For months after vows under Australian stars. For months after promises of forever. For months after Keith Urban thought love might finally be strong enough to keep the demons locked away. It wasn't. The relapse, music, didn't come crashing in with fireworks. It slid in quietly, sneaky, the way addiction always does. A drink at a party to steady nerves wrecked by tabloid pressure. A line of cocaine just to push through being dead tired. Just once, he told himself. Just to take the edge off. Just to feel normal. But addiction doesn't bargain. It doesn't do just once. Within weeks, Keith was using again, stashing bottles in closets, slipping away between calls with Nicole, lying effortlessly, like someone who'd been lying to himself for years. The guy who'd battled so hard for sobriety was sinking again. And this time, the shame hit different. Nicole didn't find out through some heartfelt confession. She found out because the truth couldn't stay hidden anymore. Shaking hands, empty eyes, lies that stopped making sense. When she confronted him, it wasn't anger that broke him. It was something way worse. Heartbreak. Music. I'm losing you, she said, tears running down her face. And I can't watch you destroy music yourself. That wrecked Keith in a way rejection never had. This wasn't the industry saying he wasn't enough. This was the woman he loved. The one who saw straight through every wall he built, telling him he was killing himself, and killing them too. On October 20th, 2006, music. Just weeks after the relapse started, Keith Urban checked himself, music, into the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, California. It wasn't some quiet exit. It was headline news. Keith Urban enters rehab, blasted across the world. The fairy tale marriage tabloids already doubted was now music, blowing up in real time. Cameras catching every brutal second. The humiliation was complete. For months married and already falling apart. The man who clawed his way from obscurity to fame was now a warning story. Online forums dragged him. Radio hosts cracked jokes. And Keith, stuck inside the clean white walls of rehab, had to face not only his addiction, but the destruction it left behind. Nicole, though, did something nobody expected. In a public statement that shocked the industry, she said, "I love my husband. Our love for each other is strong, and we are committed to our life together." That wasn't PR fluff. That was straight-up defiance. She refused to walk away when everyone assumed she would. For 90 days, Keith went through intense treatment. Group therapy where he dug into the roots of his addiction. Not just drugs and alcohol, but fear, insecurity, that nonstop belief that he'd never be enough. One-on-one counseling stripped away every excuse until he stood face to face with the truth. He was an addict, and this fight was for life. The days were rough. Withdrawal tore through his body. Shame ate at his mind. At night, he wrote Nicole letters. Apologies soaked in tears. Promises he hoped he could actually keep. She wrote back every day, letters that became his lifeline, reminding him why staying alive mattered. When Keith came out in January 2007, he wasn't magically fixed. There's no cure for addiction. But he was clear-eyed, humbled, and painfully aware of how close he'd come to losing everything. His first public moment was at the Grammy Awards, performing with shaky hands and a voice cracked with emotion. The applause roared, but it was Nicole's eyes in the crowd that grounded him. "She saved my life," Keith later said, his voice breaking under the truth. "Not by fixing me, but by not giving up on me when I'd already quit on myself." That relapse was the darkest point of Keith Urban's life. But it also became the fire that built a new kind of strength. Not fake toughness, but the strength to admit he was broken and keep fighting anyway. The marriage tabloids swore wouldn't last became proof of resilience, of love tested hard and choosing to stay. Keith got sober again. But this time, no illusions. The fight wouldn't end. The demons wouldn't vanish. The only way forward was one day at a time. One decision at a time. One breath at a time. In 2009, Keith Urban dropped Defying Gravity, an album that wasn't just a title, but his life story. Every track came from a man who almost fell too far to climb back. The lead single, Sweet Thing, hit #1. But the win felt different. It wasn't about proving himself to Nashville or shutting critics up. It was about proving to himself he could create without self-destructing. The album was raw, vulnerable in ways he'd never allowed before. Critics called it his most honest work. Fans heard the pain woven through every lyric. And Keith, for the first time, music stopped hiding behind the performance. He let the cracks show. He let the scars talk. But the real rebirth didn't happen on stage. It happened in a hospital room on July 7, 2008, when Nicole gave birth to their first daughter, Sunday Rose Kidman Urban. Keith held that tiny baby, her fingers wrapped around his thumb, and something deep inside him shifted. The man who'd spent his whole life chasing approval from strangers finally got it. The only validation that mattered was in the eyes of this small, perfect human who didn't care about awards or charts. Everything changed the second she was born, Keith later admitted, emotion heavy in his voice. I knew I wasn't just living for me anymore. I was living for her. Fatherhood scared him more than fame ever did. The responsibility was total. No encores. No do-overs. Every moment counted. Every choice mattered. And Keith, the man who'd almost destroyed himself twice, now carried the weight of being someone's hero, someone's safe place, someone's dad. He flipped his whole life around. Tours got shorter. Studio time worked around bedtime routines. The guitar that used to be his escape lane turned into something he mostly played for Sundays. Lullabies got picked on the same strings that once screamed through packed arenas. Friends clocked the shift right away. Keith talked less about music and way more about Sundays, both the day and his daughter. In 2010, he dropped Get Closer, an album that straight up mirrored this change. The single Without You was written for Nicole, basically a love letter wrapped in melody, owning the darkness she walked through right beside him. It wasn't just a hit. It was a public vow, sung out loud, that he'd never take her presence for granted again. Balancing fatherhood and fame, music was a tightrope Keith walked with shaky focus. Every tour stop meant nights away from Sunday's laughter. Every album cycle meant missing milestones he could never get back. The guilt ate at him nonstop. But Nicole, always his anchor, reminded him that being present didn't mean being perfect. It meant showing up, even messy, again and again. Keith started bringing Sunday on tour whenever he could. Photos popped up of him backstage, holding her while crew members built the stage around them. Fans saw a whole new side of the guy who once hit every soft spot. He wasn't the untouchable star anymore. He was a tired, thankful dad, carrying his daughter like she was the most precious cargo on the planet. And she was. The years between 2008 and 2010 weren't smooth sailing. Sobriety still needed constant guard-up mode. The industry still wanted hits, no excuses. But Keith had found something addiction could never touch. Purpose bigger than himself. Sunday Rose became the reason he chose life every single day. And by choosing life for her, he finally figured out how to choose it for himself. On December 28, 2010, Nicole gave birth to their second daughter, Faith Margaret Kidman Urban. Delivered via surrogate after years of quiet heartbreak over fertility struggles the couple never spoke about publicly. The happiness was massive, but so was the burnout. 2 daughters under 3. 2 careers needing nonstop attention. 2 people who loved each other hard, but were learning the brutal truth that love alone doesn't hold a marriage together when it's under pressure. The tabloids smelled drama. By 2012, headlines blasted, Keith and Nicole, marriage in crisis. Paparazzi snapped every second they weren't together. Every forced smile, every awards show moment where body language got torn apart frame by frame. Anonymous sources close to the couple fed gossip pages stories of fights, of Keith's tour schedule creating unbearable distance, of Nicole's film work leaving them like ships passing in the night. The rumors weren't totally fake. Behind closed doors, Keith and Nicole were struggling, not with cheating or betrayal, but with something sneakier. The slow breakdown of connection under impossible expectations. Keith was touring 9 months a year, chasing momentum. His sobriety and career had finally found solid ground. Nicole was filming across continents, her career roaring back after years of holding Keith down through his darkest seasons. When they came back together, exhaustion filled the room where conversation should have lived. Keith would roll home still buzzing from shows, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, unable to flip the switch into quiet family mode. Nicole, drained from 12-hour shoots and the non-stop grind of motherhood, needed rest, not road stories. They loved each other, but they were forgetting how to actually be partners. We were becoming roommates, Keith admitted years later, the words heavy with regret. Two people raising kids together, slowly losing each other in the process. In 2013, they made the call that saved them. Therapy, not as a last-ditch move, but as a real commitment. They sat across from a counselor and stripped away every defense, every excuse, every trick they'd learned to dodge the hard talks. Keith faced his habit of burying himself in work when feelings got overwhelming. Nicole looked hard at her pattern of carrying the family's emotional weight alone, never asking for help even when she was drowning. The sessions were rough. Truths came out that stung bad. Resentments surfaced that music both had tried to shove aside. But slowly, painfully, they started rebuilding. Not the fairy tale the world expected, but a real marriage. Messy, imperfect, and rooted in choice. In 2016, on their 10th wedding anniversary, Keith and Nicole renewed their vows in a private ceremony with only their daughters and a few close friends. No cameras, no tabloids, just two people who had survived addiction, public scrutiny, career chaos, and the non-stop grind of marriage, choosing each other all over again. Keith wrote a song for it. He performed it with tears rolling down his face while Sunday and Faith watched, too young to grasp the weight of the moment. Two broken people refusing to break apart. The renewal wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. A promise that even when tired, even when distant, even when the world whispered it'd be easier to walk away, music, they'd stay. Not because it was easy, but because what they had, music, built together, was worth fighting for. Fatherhood hit deeper during these years. Keith learned how to be present, not just physically, but emotionally too. He read bedtime stories with his phone off. He skipped industry events to catch Sunday school plays. He taught Faith her first chords on a guitar made to fit her tiny hands. And in those quiet, unglamorous moments, he found a joy no stadium roar had ever matched. The marriage survived, but only because both chose, every single day, to do the work love demands when the first fire fades into the steadier, tougher warmth of real commitment. In early 2015, Keith got the phone call every son fears. His father, Bob Urban, the man who worked endless hours in a Queensland convenience store to buy a 6-year-old boy a secondhand guitar, had been diagnosed with cancer. The outlook was bad. Not years. Months. Maybe less. Keith was mid-North American tour, selling out arenas, living the dream his dad had sacrificed everything for. But suddenly, every stage felt empty. Every standing ovation rang hollow. His father was dying on the other side of the world, and Keith was singing while time slipped through his fingers. He started flying to Australia between tour stops. Brutal 20-hour trips that left him, music, wrecked physically but emotionally, hanging by a thread. He'd land in Brisbane, drive straight to his parents' home in Caboolture, and sit beside his dad's bed, holding the same rough hands that once placed a guitar into his small palms. Bob was weak now, his body torn up by illness, but his eyes still held the quiet pride he never put into words. Keith would play old country songs they'd listened to decades earlier, and Bob would close his eyes and smile, the music saying what words couldn't. "I'm sorry I wasn't here more," Keith whispered one visit, guilt crushing his chest. Bob shook his head gently. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be," he rasped. "You made something of it, just like I asked." Those words, spoken through labored breath, became both forgiveness and music, heartbreak. Keith had spent his whole life chasing his father's approval, never really believing he'd earned it. And now, with death in the room, Bob finally gave it to him. But it came wrapped in goodbye. On December 5, 2015, Bob Urban passed away quietly, surrounded by family. Keith was there, holding his father's hand as the man who gave him everything slipped into silence. The grief wasn't loud or dramatic. It was huge, an ocean of loss that swallowed Keith whole. He canceled tour dates. He disappeared from public life. For weeks, he could barely talk without his voice cracking. The man who had survived addiction, scandal, and relapse was broken by the absence of the quiet, humble man who believed in him first. But in the wreckage of that loss, Keith found an unexpected lifeline. His daughters, Sunday and Faith, too young to fully understand death, only saw their dad hurting and answered with pure, simple love. They climbed into his lap during his darkest moments. They brought him drawings. They sang songs way off key, pure, innocent, full of hope, reminding him that life keeps rolling even when grief feels forever. Keith hit a moment of crystal-clear realization that music. He was now the dad Bob had been. The guy handing out guitars, both real ones and the deeper, metaphor kind. The quiet hype man for dreams. And by honoring his father's memory, Keith learned how to truly show up for his daughters in ways Bob's generation was never taught. He put a photo of Bob inside his tour bus. Before every show, Keith tapped it. A silent prayer. A promise. I'll keep making something out of this, Dad. I swear. And yeah, he did. In 2025, Keith Urban stands at 57 years old. Not as the wrecked addict who almost died twice. Not as the invisible immigrant Nashville once shut out. But as a man who mastered the brutal art of surviving himself. His hair streaked with silver now. Deep lines carved around eyes that have seen sky-high fame and rock-bottom despair. And still, those eyes carry something they didn't have back then. Peace. Hard-won and fragile, but legit. He still performs, but the non-stop grind has slowed down. These days, Keith picks his spots, festivals and venues that let him get back home to Nashville in days, not months. He also serves as a coach on The Voice Australia, a role that brings things full circle, back to the country that raised him, guiding young artists who remind him of the terrified kid who once stepped on stage with bleeding fingers and wild, impossible dreams. I see myself in every one of them, Keith says in interviews, his voice, music, softening. The hunger, the fear, the belief that music is the only language that actually makes sense. At home, life centers around Nicole and their daughters. Sunday Rose, now 16, has her mom's striking beauty and her dad's music, quiet intensity. Faith Margaret, 14, plays guitar with the same locked-in obsession Keith once brought to those childhood practice sessions in Kabul. The girls attend private school in Nashville, shielded as much as possible from the spotlight that defined their parents' early years together. Keith and Nicole, married 19 years now, have straight up proved the tabloids wrong. Their relationship isn't the fairy tale people once imagined. It's deeper than that. A partnership built through chaos, held together by choice. They walk red carpets, sure, but the moments Keith values most are low-key. Sunday mornings flipping pancakes. Movie nights curled up on the couch. Conversations that run deep into the night. Two people who've seen each other at rock bottom and still chose to stay. She's my best friend, Keith says, simple and real. And that line carries the weight of 1,000 battles fought side by side. His sobriety milestone now sits at 18 years since the 2006 relapse. 18 years of daily discipline. 18 years of meetings, resisting temptation, choosing clarity over blackout. The count matters to Keith. Every year is a win. Every single day is a decision. But time's collected its dues. Years of performing left his lower back constantly inflamed. The price of hauling guitars and bending over strings for endless hours. His hearing, wrecked by amplified sound, now needs aids during quiet conversations. Reading glasses are here to stay. The body that once felt unstoppable is now a roadmap of consequences. Every acre receipt for a life lived at full volume. Money-wise, Keith's built a fortune estimated at $75 million. Properties include a massive estate in Nashville's Belle Meade neighborhood, a beachfront escape in Australia, and a New York apartment for when Nicole films on the East Coast. His car collection, once flex fuel, mostly sits untouched now. Leftovers from a younger man trying to prove success through stuff. These days, his money flows more toward giving back. He funds music education in underserved communities, scholarships for Australian artists chasing the Nashville dream he once chased, and addiction recovery centers that literally saved his life. Money can't buy sobriety, he says, but it can give someone a fighting chance. His musical legacy? Locked in. Over 20 million albums sold. 4 Grammy Awards. 15 Academy of Country Music Awards. Inducted into the Grand Ole Opry. But when asked about his greatest achievement, Keith never points to trophies. He points to Sunday and faith. To the marriage that survived. To 18 years of sobriety, stacked one day at a time. I'm not a legend, he insists. I'm just a man who got more chances than he probably deserved. And I'm trying to make them count. Keith Urban's story isn't a fairy tale. It's something way more valuable. Proof of the brutal, beautiful truth that we're not defined by how hard we fall, but by how many times we get back up. From the invisible boy in Kabul whose father placed a second-hand guitar into small hands. To the rejected dreamer who came back to Nashville with nothing but stubborn hope. To the addict who almost destroyed everything, twice. To the father who learned that love is the only empire worth building. Keith's road has been anything but smooth. He stood on the biggest stages, music, and crawled through the darkest valleys. He's held Grammy Awards with the same hands that once shook from withdrawal. He's been celebrated by millions and felt completely alone in rooms full of applause. He's been loved, shattered, rebuilt, and loved again. And through it all, one truth stayed solid. Survival isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. Today, when Keith looks ahead, he talks less about records and more about memories. About watching Sunday and Faith grow up. About being present for moments touring once stole. He quietly mentions the idea of retirement. Not from music, but from the relentless pace that nearly killed him. "I want to grow old with Nicole," he says softly. "I want to teach my daughters that success isn't what you achieve, it's who you become while chasing it." His legacy won't just be measured in platinum albums or sold-out arenas. As real as those are, it'll be measured in the lives he touched through honesty. The artists he mentored, the addicts he inspired to fight one more day, and the two daughters who'll carry his lessons long after the final note fades. Keith Urban isn't perfect. He's scarred, worn, and still fighting battles nobody sees. But maybe that's exactly why his story hits so hard. It reminds us legends aren't born invincible. They're forged in failure, shaped by pain, and made beautiful by the courage to keep going. If Keith's music ever moved you, if his journey mirrors your own struggles, hit like. Subscribe for more untold journeys. Drop your thoughts below about second chances, redemption, or the power of never quitting. Because at the end of the day, Keith Urban teaches us the realest lesson of all. The greatest song you'll ever play is the one that keeps you alive to play it.